Hello, this is Rob Hiles, student ID number 26510-530, and I'm presenting my PCG Assessment 1 assignment. For it, I have made a scene in Unreal Engine 5 which shows a populated medieval landscape being destroyed by a large alien bomb. The map has been procedurally generated, textured and populated with trees and grass using the software Houdini. Additionally, I have used Houdini to create the destructible buildings and use Unreal Engine's blueprint system for the functionality. When we start, we can see a river populated with buildings either side with foliage scattered behind them. We can also see large mountains with snow at the top in the distance. When we press the B key, an explosion erupts from the ground, decimating the buildings around, the blast going on to the edge of the map. To start, I created the map, which first uses a grid object, which I remeshed for displacement later. I also created a line which would act as the river, and then I used an attribute wrangle node to create the normals for it. I then used the mountain node, which used the normals to create the jagged shape of the river. I then coloured both objects and used attribute transfer to place the river on the grid. I then created an attribute wrangle node which created a float called river, taking the red channel of each pixel of the grid, which would be used for the displacement node next. For displacement, I used an attribute VOP node in which I added noise, a ramp node to control the flatness. I multiplied it by the river value, which meant it would not displace along the river, and then I displaced it and outputted it to the geometry. The next node after displace is another wrangle node, which displaces the river section downwards, and then the one after that selects that section and puts it into a river point group, and then it is promoted from points to primitives. After that, the next set of nodes are in charge of defining the play area. The first two initially define their area using a bounding region and using the normals. They are then altered using group combine, the first one depending on its vicinity to the river, and the second one is the opposite of that. The third one checks regions using a vex expression above the y value 0.75, and then the next one selects the water region. After that, we use two scatter nodes, which defines the areas for which grass and trees can be placed, for which we use copy to point. We then use UV project and quick shade, and then we merge them all together for a finalized map, which we output using ROP FXB. For the destructible buildings, apart from creating different models, I use the same workflow for both. I initially made a model with a similar amount of detail to the foliage and terrain. I then created the area I wanted to be exploded and used a mountain node for 3D noise, and then I used a boolean to create both the area I wanted to keep still and the area I wanted to be destructed. For the part I wanted to explode, I first remeshed, and then I used rigid body material fracture to decide on the points at which I wanted it to break. After assembling, I used a sphere, I took its normals, and then I used attribute transfer, which created the collision force that I wanted. I then used attribute wrangle to get a speed variable, which I could alter, and then I decided to have two attribute creates, which, depending on the value, it would simulate this and it would ignore this. I then used rigid body bullet solver to create the simulation, and then I exported it through the out channel and used the lab's RBD to FBX to export it to an FBX file. Unfortunately, because of an error in Unreal Engine 5, I had to use Unreal Engine 4 to import it into that and then bake the animation so it could be then used in Unreal Engine 5. In Unreal Engine, I use two essentially the same blueprints, which had both the skeletal mesh and a detection cube. And when something overlapped with the detection cube, it would play the animation. I also used a similar blueprint for the bomb, which had a big blue sphere using an altered glass texture from the base starter content, and when the B key was pressed, which was altered on the level blueprint, it would then it's a big sphere, and it would transform upwards, and it would appear as it was moving through the scene and kind of mushroom clouding. I believe overall, with more resources and time, I could have achieved a higher fidelity in both the placed assets and the terrain. Additionally, I could have created the whole simulation within Houdini to create a more accurate simulation of the explosion force.